Welcome to the Book Flood Podcast. I am your host, Tom Nixon. As a reminder, please like, subscribe, and share us on Apple Podcast, on YouTube, and on other podcast platforms. My guest this week is Patrick Sweeney. Patrick is a 2007 San Jose School of Library and Information Sciences graduate and a former administrative librarian and school librarian, and was executive director of EveryLibrary California, a statewide initiative to support library propositions. He was awarded Library Journal's Movers and Shakers Award in 2015 for his library advocacy work. Patrick is co-author of Winning Elections and Influencing Politicians for Library Funding, as well as Before the Ballot, Building Support for Library Funding. He was recently recognized with a 40 Under 40 award by the American Association of Political Consultants for his work fighting for libraries at EveryLibrary. Patrick is a lecturer at the San Jose State Information School where he teaches courses on politics and libraries. He is active across social media as PC Sweeney. Welcome, Patrick.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Tom. I appreciate it.
Oh, absolutely. Looking forward to our conversation today. So why don't we start with you describing your career path a little bit? I gave some idea of that, but share what you'd like.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually started as an elementary school librarian in Santa Cruz, California, at a school called Green Acres, which was by far the best job I've ever had in my entire life. The books were right at my reading and interest level with books like Walter the Farting Dog and stuff like that. So, it was great. It was great. And then I became a public library manager. I got to manage libraries in Northern California, and then I was a director in Sunnyvale, California. Up until I moved to New York and took on EveryLibrary full time. I am one of the co-founders of EveryLibrary, and we work to support libraries at the local, state, and federal level through political initiatives and stuff like that.
What do you see as the greatest dangers to libraries in 2025 and beyond?
I think it starts with everything that we've seen for the last 4 or 5 years. We did start EveryLibrary in 2012 in response to what came out of the recession as the any tax is a bad tax movement. With the rise of the Tea Party, libertarian movement kind of gained traction. Is a lot of anger and turmoil around what happened during the recession. They kind of saw libraries as a soft target. Those organizations, right. An organization that was easy to attack, a place to get some easy wins. And we saw like the Koch brothers, Americans for Prosperity PAC spending thousands of dollars to tank library ballot initiatives. We saw the rise of those any tax is a bad tax groups coming out against libraries in new ways that we'd never really seen before. And libraries, of course, are largely, they don't really have any way to defend themselves from these attacks. They're government agencies, they're government employees. They can't advocate for themselves in the same way that the people that are advocating against them, they can't use those same tools or tactics. The library industry largely has been politically apathetic for almost its entire existence, even though 98% of library funding comes from the will of voters and legislators at the local, state, and federal level. Libraries generally just want to see, kids read books. They want to see Americans improve their lives, that kind of thing. And so without any kind of political defense, these organizations started coming out against them. And then, of course, when COVID happened, we saw Moms for Liberty and those kinds of groups coming out against libraries in much more sophisticated ways, attacking libraries on a much broader level. I mean, we just recently saw the Library of Congress, Librarian of Congress get fired last week. We saw the woman who was in charge of copyright fired last week. The National Archivist was fired a couple of months ago. Trump defunded IMLS in his proposed budget for 2025. We saw school libraries, military academy libraries, and military bases, military-based libraries getting all of their books banned, or a wide selection of books banned based largely on race and gender issues. But also, I mean, these are like classic books like Maya Angelou and stuff like that are getting removed. We saw significant attacks on school libraries, public libraries, legislation to allow for the incarceration of school librarians, publishers. They came after booksellers like Barnes and Noble. They tried to sue them over the books that they were selling. They tried to arrest book publishers over the books that they were publishing. What's left for 2025? I don't know. What is left to take away? What else is left? And so we're in this really, I think, very terrifying spot where a lot of the lead organizations are being disrupted in very aggressive and violent ways. I think that we're going to see attacks on librarians escalate. We're already seeing, we've seen bomb threats at public libraries. I talk to librarians all the time who are getting like bullets mailed to their home address,
Wow.
being called pedophiles and groomers and being attacked and, stuff like that. So, I mean, how much worse can it get? I don't know. I have no idea how much worse it can get, quite honestly. I'm very scared for a lot of my friends, for a lot of my colleagues, for librarians across the country.
It's one of these things where just when you think it can't get any worse, it just does.
Yeah.
What's your take on the firing of Dr. Hayden as Library of Congress librarian?
Yeah, that's really, really interesting because I'm pretty sure she was appointed during Trump's first administration. I think she was, and I could be wrong. I can't remember if she was put in place by Obama's final term or Trump's first term. I can't remember exactly. Either way, I think that this is just part of a greater disruption in, a continuing escalation in building distrust in American institutions as much as possible. I also think that this is largely a government, takeover. We are seeing, this doesn't just impact libraries. We're seeing it across the board at every government
Certainly.
institution, that the previous directors are all being fired and replaced with Trump supporters. Like the person that they just put in charge of the Library of Congress was announced today. He was Trump's attorney for the lawsuits previously against Trump. He was defending Trump. And so he was given this installation, I think, in large part in order to give him, the reward for supporting Trump.
And not a librarian.
Not a librarian.
No background.
The interesting thing about not a librarian, the thing we have to remember too is Carla Hayden was by far like the most qualified librarian of Congress we've ever had.
Certainly.
The previous Librarian of Congress was put in place in the 80s during the Cold War because he was an academic on Russia. And Reagan needed somebody to walk Russians around who spoke Russian, who looked like he was from an important unit of government. And he was there until 2015. That was his only qualification. There's a lot of stories about him refusing to learn how to use email. So if you wanted to communicate with the Librarian of Congress, you had to send a fax or whatever, so it was like weird stuff like that we heard, those kinds of stories. Whether or not that's true or not, I don't know. But he wasn't there because he was a qualified Librarian of Congress. Right.
Well, and he could go out and do what our California State Librarian did, who was not a qualified librarian. Greg Lucas goes out and gets a master's from your alma mater.
Yeah, he was one of my students.
Oh, really? Yeah. Oh, fun.
Yeah.
I had him on the podcast, and very, very serious about libraries in California. And I
Yeah,
remember the flack he got at the beginning because he wasn't a librarian.
yeah.
But this is a path that's open to this new
Hmm.
guy as
Hmm.
well. I won't hold my breath. I won't hold my breath. So every library has certainly had some challenges, but you've also had some wins as well. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the way that every library works, we don't do a lot of the direct political action ourselves. We are an organization that works to build political support for libraries, but we work with local community members, local community groups, people who are just, moms and dads, aunts and uncles, people like that who want to see children read, who want to see people access their public libraries. Um, and so we provide a lot of support to those kinds of organizations, websites, data, direct and indirect funding, that kind of thing. The same kind of support that we're seeing the other side give, Moms for Liberty and those kinds of things. Because it really is up to the public to stand up and fight back. Um,
Hmm.
you know, we we were originally built to support libraries that were going to the voters, so ballot initiatives, those kinds of things. And we've done 160 of those over the last 13 years. We've helped libraries earn about $3.2 billion in stable funding from that, because that is
Wow.
the largest piece of funding. But we see a number of these groups. When the public stands up and they're given the tools and they're given the resources and they're given the infrastructure and the things they need to understand how to win, like, we see those wins happen. It doesn't happen as often, through the public library or through the librarian, simply because they can't do that level of work as government employees. So, we've seen um, uh, quite a few wins across the country. Um, I can list them, but I mean, if you go to everylibrary.org, you can take a look at them. I think that's more interesting. But, like, understanding that we're part of this network that's building in order to push back against libraries. Yeah.
Hmm. Absolutely. So you talked a little bit about the president's budget and cutting IMLS funding, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, probably for the general public. This is the first time they even knew that this
Yeah.
existed in the world. Uh, how do you talk to folks about what this will mean for their local public library?
Yeah. Um, so one of the biggest things that we faced, we saw this coming. I mean, we saw this coming. Trump's last administration, 2017 to 2020, he, in his proposed budget, eliminated federal funding for IMLS every single time. And we faced this issue back then, so we kind of knew it was coming. We had a better plan this time. Like you said, not very many Americans know that IMLS exists, even though they interact with services provided to them by IMLS anytime they go into their local public library. Most librarians and library workers don't know that IMLS even exists,
Right.
which I think is really interesting. But you don't really notice a unit of government until it stops functioning. And I think in the next couple of years, with the elimination of IMLS, we're going to see the loss of a lot of different things, and we're going to see a significant increase in local taxes being necessary to replace that. So, for example, interlibrary loan is largely funded through IMLS federal
Hmm.
funding to LSDA to help pay for uh, interlibrary loans. So right now, you can get a book from almost any library in the country, quite a few libraries from around the world, on any text, manuscripts, all those kinds of things, and you can do it for free, or with a fee of like $1.75. I think was one of the highest, like, interlibrary loan fees that people charged. And the reason that was being able to be provided was because of these federal funds. And the reason that's necessary is because there's so many rules and restrictions around what local taxes can pay for. So it's very hard for you to move tax money from one municipality to another. And I think rightly so, because, like, you wouldn't want Dallas to take, Houston's education money and give it to their Parks and Rec. Like you don't want
Right.
those kinds of things to be able to happen. And so there's a lot of rules to keep that from happening. And federal funding helps get around those rules and helps bridge those deficiencies and those gaps and those divides so that things like interlibrary loan, which does require money to move between municipalities, to happen a little bit more easily. Also, that funding allows public libraries to negotiate better state level contracts for databases, for book purchases, for furniture purchases, for computer purchases, for software upgrades. All of those kinds of things can be negotiated at a larger level at the state level, which means that your overall local tax dollars go farther, because you don't have 1,000 contracts across a state like California. And I think in order to get the same level of services from a lot of these public libraries, local people are going to have to pay a lot more in taxes in order to do it. A lot of libraries are losing out on interlibrary loan, but then we're also losing things like Braille and talking book libraries. Books for the blind, it's gone in a lot of states. Tribal libraries, gone in a lot of states. So like we really are hitting a lot of people, I think, in really negative ways by removing IMLS, at a very foundational level.
Is there a path back from this?
There is through the courts. I mean, I would say there should be a path. No, I will say that there should be a path out of this through the courts. However, or through Congress. However, there is no guarantee that the Trump administration will listen to court orders or follow rules from Congress. There's nothing that says that he will do that. In fact, there's a lot of indication that says that he'll just ignore anything that goes against his orders. So, we're looking at the political installation of individuals at some of these institutions. We're seeing ignoring court orders. We're seeing ignoring checks and balances, ignoring rules from the Supreme Court or from Congress, and aligning a lot of power at that executive branch, which is very scary for a lot of different reasons outside of librarianship. And I think this all just kind of funnels back into that place, So is there a way out of this? Yes, technically there is. In a coup, I don't know.
Right?
Yeah.
It's easy for us to focus on libraries, and we should, given who you are and given who I am, we should.
Right.
But this is so much bigger.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
What do you?
I think what's interesting too, like as we're just watching what happens, and one of the things that I think scares me the most about all of this is this whole, it started in school libraries, then it went to going after school librarians, allowing for arresting school librarians, and then public libraries, and then arresting public librarians, and then publishers, and it scales all the way up to where we are now, Library of Congress, and all that. But the organizations that were behind a lot of this movement, once Trump was elected, they just kind of vanished off the face of the earth. And I think more people need to pay attention to that. Like organizations like No Left Turn in Education, gone. And they were one of the biggest drivers behind, book bans, controlling what's in our schools and school libraries and stuff like that. And once Trump was elected, they just vaporized. And that should be troubling and looked into by people much smarter than me,
Right.
I don't know what's behind that. I don't know why that happened. I have a pretty good idea about why that happened. But things like that, I think, are very scary.
No, I would agree. And it's almost as if it was all part of a grand plan, if you will.
Well, when we look at Project 2025, we did a bunch of reports on Project 2025. If you go like EveryLibrary Project 2025, we have a bunch of reports on that. And you can see like it's playing out exactly as we said it would, a year ago. So,
right.
Yeah.
Oh. Where do you see your organization headed given all of this? It's every library has been such a fierce advocate for libraries, uh, not just this week, but for quite some time. Where do you think things are headed?
For our organization, I mean, this is kind of the problematic situation in politics and the part that makes me feel gross about politics. You know, people are coming to us in a way that's very different than they were a few years ago. They're either coming to us to ask for support for them, or they're coming to us to give us support. And I appreciate both of those things very much. But in like 2016, I went to an American Association of Political Consultants conference, and I was talking to someone who does like high level politics. Like I'm very low level politics, but this guy was doing like presidential level politics, like big politics. And I explained to him what EveryLibrary does, and he said, "Oh, that's really really interesting because, and that sounds like it's incredibly difficult." And I said, "Well, why do you think that?" And he said, "Well, because everybody loves libraries, but nobody cares." And I was like, "That's exactly the problem that we are facing in like 2016, 17, or whatever." And it's a different field now because libraries are a big piece of the public discourse. We're seeing libraries being talked about in a way they've never been talked about before. We're seeing them put into just national discussions in a very different way, and people who care are showing up in a very different way. So when we talk about the work that we're doing, when we're talking about how we're supporting the public's fight for libraries, that work is allowing us to do things like, for every dollar that every library raises, we're able to return about $1,600 in funding for libraries. Like there's like it's significant, it's impactful, it's dramatic, and people are listening to that in a way that they never really did before. you know and so I think that's incredibly important that people understand this. Like if we're talking about within the library industry, there is opportunity here in a way that libraries have never had before, to be a part of the public discussion, to be talking about the role and relevancy of libraries in American society in a way that we've never been able to speak about before. And I think that opportunity exists for a lot of our organizations, especially EveryLibrary, who does this like day-to-day groundwork, and has been for 13 years to engage with this public discourse in new and interesting ways, and to take advantage of kind of the crisis that's happening right now.
So you talked about what has happened with the military schools, the Department of Defense schools, and also the military academies. What's driving that?
Um, you know, I think that this is largely manufactured outrage and construction of like boogeymen in order to garner public support, raise money, and identify supporters to increase political power and influence. So, one of the things that, again, that I very much dislike about politics is that, only people who are radicalized about an issue make contributions to that issue. If you're like the whales, they're fine. You're not going to get on a boat and go save the whales. You're not going to give $20 to, an organization that's fighting to save the whales. You're not going to do it because you're like, whales are fine. But if whales are like your number one issue, if you're like, whales are it, whales are what I care about, you will get on the boat, or you will give $20. You'll volunteer your time, you'll volunteer your money, you will provide the resources necessary to power a movement around whales. And I think that these kinds of attacks energize radicalized supporters, and help radicalize their own base and network, so that they're able to raise a lot of money. In fact, I think that's what's powering a lot of the book ban movement. Like a lot of these organizations, They attacked librarians, knowing librarians couldn't fight back. They pushed librarians to be pedophiles and groomers, knowing librarians couldn't fight back. That calling librarians pedophiles and groomers is radicalized language that really only engages with a radicalized minority of humans. But those radicalized minority of humans are making a donation. It was very easy for those organizations to say, we just saved your children from pedophiles and groomers. Give $5 today, and they were able to raise significant amounts of money.
Right.
So I do think that there is some level of scam pack, play that's happening. And I do think that they're raising these resources. They're manufacturing outrage, doing these grandstanding things like around the military libraries in order to engage with their radicalized fraction of supporters to raise money and accumulate political power and influence.
What should librarians know about the current attacks that are happening?
Yeah, I think librarians need to know that it's not about them. It is about them, but it's not really about them. They are collateral damage in a much larger, more ferocious war that's going on in this country. And it's very hard for me to say don't take it personally, because they're not after you. They're after taxes and they're after government, and you are a tax-funded government organization. It's not that over and over and over again, even from some of our most vicious attackers, they don't hate libraries, they say. It's not about whether or not people hate libraries or librarians. It's about the hatred of taxes and government.
So, what are you reading now?
Man, what am I reading now? I'm on this really weird history kick right now. I watched this show a while ago that talked about Alexander the Great, and I realized I didn't know anything about Alexander the Great really. So I read a book on Alexander the Great, which took me to a book on the Crusades, which I think is a really fascinating read during this era, because I think a lot of this is powered by sort of religious fanaticism, what's happening right now. And it was very interesting to read that book and seeing what's happening now and the parallels between the Crusades and sort of this religious fanaticism that's kind of happening right now. Not a lot of people know that the Crusades were launched largely because it had been 1,000 years since Jesus' death, and they thought whoever controlled the Holy Land, Jesus would be resurrected after 1,000 years, and therefore would win favor with God and be, the army of God. And so that's why the Crusades were launched, which I think is, when you read into the subtext behind that, it becomes really interesting. And then I found out that the Crusades ended only because Genghis Khan invaded Europe. And then I realized I didn't know anything about Genghis Khan. So then I started reading about Genghis Khan, so I'm down this whole very interesting thing. And now I'm all the way up to the Dust Bowl. I just finished a book on the American Dust Bowl, which once again, with what's happening, in America in the 20s, we are America in the 20s now,
right.
So I think it's been a very interesting journey on my reading lately.
Is there a book or a series of books from your childhood that still resonates with you?
Yes. Chronicle of Narnia. I think that was significantly impactful in my childhood, for sure. Also Calvin and Hobbes, but for very different reasons.
Absolutely. No, for very good other reasons, though.
Yeah.
Well, Patrick, I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And to our listeners and watchers, please like, subscribe, and share. And again, thank you, Patrick.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Take care.